Welcome to today's event, sponsored by the Center for the Study of Europe here at Boston University. My name is Sofia Perez. I'm a faculty member, both in the Political Science Department and with the Center for the Study of Europe. And it is my great pleasure tonight to introduce our guest, Chantal Mouffe. I assume that most of you here know who Chantal Mouffe is. She is one of the most important political theorists in Europe today. She is best known for co-founding, along with Ernesto Laclau, what is known in Europe as the Essex School of Discourse Analysis, and for co-authoring, together with Laclau, the book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, Verso 1985, which is really the founding text in that school. She's also the author of many other books, among them The Democratic Paradox from 2000, which is not here, but we do have her latest book, which is Agonistics, Thinking the World Politically. And that came out in 2013. Both Hegemony and Socialist Strategy and Agonistics are available outside and you're welcome to look at them when we have the after session reception. Chantal Mouffe is known for arguing forcefully for a radicalization of democracy or agonistic democracy, perhaps also pluralist agonism. She can tell us more about perhaps which one of those terms is the most appropriate. And she has been a critic of Habermas's conception of deliberative democracy, which she juxtaposes agonistic democracy to. Her work is considered to have inspired various left populist movements, in particular, though not only, Podemos in Spain. And in fact, she recently also authored a book that is based on a conversation with one of the key leaders of Podemos, Íñigo Errejón. Today, she will be speaking on the problem of democracy in a post-political age. Now, before allowing her to do that, I would first of all like to thank her, Chantal Mouffe, very much for coming here and speaking to us at Boston University. And we also have some other people to thank. So now I'm going to say a little bit more about this series. This event is taking place as part of a longer-term project entitled EU Futures, the aim of which is to explore the emerging future in Europe. It is the 7th in a series of conversations on the prospects of democratic politics in Europe in the aftermath of the recent financial crisis. By democratic politics, we refer precisely to the ability of citizens to determine their own future, building on Niklas Luhmann's assertion that what is special about democracy is its unusual keeping open of possibilities of future choice. It is our contention that current political arrangements are not only undermining citizens' ability to determine their own futures, but also their very ability to imagine alternatives to the status quo. The project is funded by a Getting to Know Europe grant from the European Commission delegation in Washington, D.C., to Boston University's Center for the Study of Europe. We are grateful to the delegation for their support of our initiative. I'd like to take a minute to remind you all that the event is being recorded. If you would like to ask a question during the question and answer part, please wait for the microphone. The event will last approximately 90 minutes, and then it will be followed by a reception and book signing to which you are all cordially invited. So without taking any further of your time, let me allow Chantal to take the word.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the presentation. So we are going to talk about the future of democracy in a post-political age. When we envisage the nature, the present state of democracy, one of the assertions that we often come across is that our current condition is one of post-democracy. The meaning conveyed by this notion of post-democracy is that modern democracies, while maintaining the facade of formal democratic principles, are increasingly controlled by privileged elites. And that, for instance, because the first one to have brought about this question of post-democracy is, in fact, Colin Crouch, a British sociologist, who in a book called Post-Democracy, and this is where he insists on this problem with post-democracy. I agree with him, but so you are going to see, I think that there are some aspects that are overlooked by the approach of post-democracy. But basically, he insists, there are, in fact, while all the institutions still exist, the decisions are not taken by privileged elites. The implementation of neoliberal policies has led to the colonization of the state by corporate interests, and crucial political decisions are now taken outside of the democratic political channels. This is the origin of a loss of legitimacy of democratic institutions, loss which manifests itself in a growing phenomenon of depoliticization. Here I want to insist, in fact, that my reflection is basically elaborated on the basis of the European experience. No, I think that some aspect might be also conversion with the US, but it's really a reflection starting from the European situation. And I mean, this, of course, is phenomenon of depoliticization is something which is very clear in Europe. And in fact, this is something which, as we are going to say, something which is beginning to change. But basically, when I speak of post-political age, I speak of this phenomenon of despoliticization. And therefore, this is important because it is a growing phenomenon, and I'm going to show in a moment that it's in reaction against that right-wing populist parties are developing. So I agree with many aspects of the analysis of post-democracy, particularly the fact that no political decisions are taken by outside the political channel. But I think that when we examine the reason for this phenomenon, and particularly for the consequence of this phenomenon, which is this depoliticization, and then we envisage, and I think this is for me what is really important, how this tendency can be reversed. I think it's important then to stress the role of the parties of the left, the role that they've played in this process of disaffection with democratic politics. And that's not something that the analysis of Colin Crouch, for instance, take into account. In a book, in fact, which was published between the democratic paradox and agonistic, which is called On the Political, I have examined the reason for what I call, in that book, the post-political perspective, which has become dominant in liberal democratic societies. And I have argued that this is linked to the move towards the center, which in the last decades have been the strategy of social democratic parties, mainly in Europe, a strategy which under the motto of the third way, which of course was first elaborated for New Labour in Britain by Anthony Giddens. This is clearly the very origin of the post-political perspective. According to that approach, Western societies have entered a second stage of modernity, what they call reflexive modernization. In fact, Tony Giddens is not the only one to defend the view, because in Germany, Ulrich Beck also defended the same view, that we are now in a second modernity. And the characteristic of the second modernity is that the adversarial model of politics, so they say was characteristic of the first stage of modernity, or sometimes they refer to that stage as simple modernization. This model is become obsolete to the adversarial model. Giddens claims that it's no necessary to think beyond left and right. In fact, that's the title of one of his book, and envisage a new type of politics that he calls of the radical center, which transcends the old-fashioned left-right divide. So that began in Britain, but such a view was later accepted by other socialist and social democratic parties, as I say, first in Germany with Gerhard Schröder and his Neue Mitte, but then, France, Italy, it spread, in fact, very much in Europe. And the idea was that social democratic project needed to be modernized so as to adapt it to a globalized world. And this is what led social democratic parties or labor parties or socialist parties, it depends how they are referred to move themselves to the center, in fact, to present themselves as center-left parties. Well, I think that, in fact, under the pretense of modernizing the social democratic project, what they really did was to abandon it and capitulate to neoliberalism. Convinced that there was no alternative to the current form of globalized financial capitalism, those parties have accepted the framework which had been established by neoliberal hegemony. That was clearly the case in Britain with Tony Blair, who succeeded Margaret Thatcher, but without at all putting into question the neoliberal hegemony that had been established by Thatcher. Having abandoned any attempt to challenge the existing relation of power, social democratic parties now limit themselves to propose ways to humanize, so to speak, neoliberal globalization. I mean, a little bit more of redistribution, but nothing, that will be fundamentally different. And this is why their policies are, in fact, very hard to distinguish from the center-right parties. Center-right, center-left, they present basically the same policies on the basis that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. Well, it is my contention that this consensus at the center has very negative consequences for democratic politics. Indeed, it is the absence of a real choice between clearly distinguishable alternatives which explain, in my view, the current lack of interest for politics, which has produced a drastic fall in participation in election. That's the first consequence. Another consequence of this conversion between center-right and center-left is that in several countries, such a situation has favored the emergence of right-wing populist parties, whose success is due to the fact that they appear to be the only one that offer an alternative to the existing order. Here I want to say something, because this analysis, I did develop it in this book, On the Political, published in 2005. It was at a moment, in fact, in which there was not yet so many right-wing populist parties. I mean, we had very important right-wing populist parties in Austria with the FPÖ, in France, but there was not as many as there are today. And at that moment, I was already, I think, it may be pretentious to say that, but I think that I saw clearly that this was going, this consensus at the center was going to create the terrain for development of right-wing populist parties. And, 10 years later, we can see, well, this has exactly been the case, because now we've got right-wing populist parties in all countries in Europe. Well, and it seems to me that in the discussion about post-democracy, the role played by this post-political situation and the consequences, the political consequences, is not sufficiently taken into account. Of course, it is necessary to grasp the transformation of the capitalist system, which have provided the economic condition for the success of neoliberal globalization. And that was, the center of the post-democracy has been seen by Colin Crouch. But that does not automatically explain the reason for the disappearance of a vibrant democratic debate, a debate about the different ways in which social relations and public institutions could be organized. And this is, I think, where the parties of the left need to be, their role need to be criticized. By failing to acknowledge that politics is intrinsically partisan and that democratic politics requires what I call an agonistic debate, a more conflicting project, and a choice between real alternatives, the consensual politics of the third way is in fact contributed to the disaffection with politics, which is at the core of the post-democratic condition. When citizens feel that they cannot have a say in the fundamental decision which concern their common affair, and that political questions are dealt with by experts, because they are, of course, considered of a technical nature, then democratic institutions are emptied of their substance and their legitimacy is threatened. Elections are reduced to providing a rubber stamp for measures which are imposed by a variety of actors whose interests are not publicly accountable. And in fact, we could say that the democratic process loses its raison d'être. That, of course, is what the term post-democracy refers to. To be sure, our societies still claim to be democratic, but what's the meaning of democracy in our post-political times? Scrutinizing the nature of liberal democracy in my book, The Democratic Paradox, I have brought to the fore the tension existing between these two ethico-political principles, liberty and equality. Liberal democracy, I contend, should be understood as the articulation between two different traditions. On one side, there is the liberal tradition, liberal in the political sense, of the rule of law, division of power, individual rights, and on the other side, the democratic tradition of popular sovereignty and with privilege the idea of equality. In fact, the Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson has shown how through this articulation, which it was established in the 19th century, and that he showed that in a book called The Life and Times of Liberal Democracy. So through this articulation, liberalism was democratized, he said, and democracy was liberalized. And this is, of course, what is really, when we speak of when we speak here about democracy, in fact, we speak about a very specific model of democracy, which is the Western model, and which is precisely this articulation between the liberal and the democratic tradition. But here, of course, what's important is to realize that there is always some kind of tension between the exigencies of liberty and the exigencies of equality. That is, that they can never be perfectly reconciled. Say a perfect equality and a perfect liberty, that cannot be existed. There's always one value, which is a lexical, privileged role. However, and here I think that it's important to see that this tension can be understood, or as, for instance, Carl Schmitt proposed, as a contradiction that will put into question the success of liberal democracy, of this articulation of democracy, or it could, in fact, be understood as, and that's the argument I make in The Democratic Paradox, some kind of tension. Tension which I see as very productive, because it is the place where pluralism can really be exercised. Here I've got problems with the light here to read my text. Maybe that's going to be better. Okay, a little bit better. So where was I? Yeah. So they can never be perfectly put into reconcile. There is always a tension. And of course, this tension is precisely what I call the agonistic debate. There are always different hegemonic projects that can be linked to either the dominance of liberty or the dominance of equality. And in fact, if we see the evolution of the democratic politics, since the time in which this articulation was established, and that's during the 19th century, as Macpherson shows, we see that there are moments in which there was a predominance of the liberal logic, at the same time predominance of the democratic logic, and of course another way to express that will be so that this distinction can be transposed in terms of the left and the right. So there is always one element which is dominant, but what was important is that tension was always existing. But I can't really see whenever this. Yeah, the problem with our present condition, and this is why we really can call of post-democratic, is that this tension does not exist anymore. It has been eliminated because of the almost total predominance of the liberal logic. The liberal logic, the idea is really the main principle is the principle of liberty. And liberty here understood again in a way which is very specific to neoliberalism. So everything which, for instance, the liberty of the market, is the liberty of the entrepreneurs. And what is important is that the other element, the democratic element, the element about popular sovereignty, this is something which has been eliminated of the political discourse. So those societies still call themselves democratic, but in fact, all the democratic element of the articulation has been really left aside. Democracy is now understood in terms of the rule of law, definition of human rights, and the idea of popular sovereignty is being declared as being obsolete. Those who resist the rule of the market and who pretend, ask for a voice, those parties which are going to want to give a voice back to the people, they are denounced as being populist. In my view, this displacement of the democratic tradition by the liberal one is one of the main features of our post-democratic condition, and it is, for instance, clearly visible in the abandon by center-left parties of the struggle for equality. Their main slogans are now about choice, fairness, equity, inclusion, but they take pains to avoid speaking of equality that they consider as too tainted by the equalitarianism of the official socialist ideals that they have repudiated. Deprived of the vocabulary that constituted the backbone of the vision of society of the left, it's not surprising then that the left is incapable of envisaging an alternative to neoliberal globalization. The consequence of this democratic at the center, consensus at the center, is that we are currently witnessing a crisis of representation. I'm going to insist very much on this element, because this consensus at the center deprives democratic citizens of this agonistic debate where they can make their voice heard and choose between real alternatives. So my claim is that without abandoning the consensual politics of the third way, there is no hope of escaping the post-democratic trends, which is at the origin of the progressive irrelevance of democratic institutions. It is necessary to fight against the blurring of the line between left and right, because one of the claims of the third way is that this is a big progress, the blurring of the line between left and right. And I think one can accept that empirically it's true that has happened. But instead of saying that it's a progress or something that is good for democracy because democracy supposedly become more mature, my argument is that no, it's not good for democracy. It is something which in fact could create serious problem because it is precisely what creates the terrain for the development of right-wing populism. So, So on the political, I insist, no, it's very important to recover this distinction between left and right, because there is a blurring, but it's a blurring which, of course, is a consequence of politics. The fact that there is not enough of this agonistic debate, and it can be reinstalled. And in fact, this is exactly what I was arguing on the political. The blurring of the line between left and right, contrary to what Beck and Giddens were arguing, is something which is very negative for democracy. And in fact, it's very important to revive this distinction. No, but I still have got a problem here. I don't know what's... Okay, I pass here to another element. So this is the argument I was making on the political, no? And it written precisely in the context of the third way, the development of the view of Anthony Giddens and of Blair, saying that no, we are, Blair used to say, we are all middle class, no, we can all agree, there is no more antagonism. Till very recently, in fact, this consensus at the center was only put into question through parties of the right. Parties of the right who, of course, articulated their resistance in a xenophobic language. Fortunately, in the last 10 years, I mean, it really began around the 2011, maybe, is the moment when things began to change. We've witnessed a different kind of resistance against this post-democratic, post-political situation, with the multiplication of a series of protest movements. With those protest movements, we are in fact seeing the emergence of much more commendable form of resistance against the post-democratic societies. And in fact, my argument is that if there are so many people in so many places which are now coming to the street, I'm referring here, of course, to what are called the movement of the places, and all those protest movements outside the parties. I mean, for instance, obviously in the US, Occupy Wall Street, but the Indignados in Spain, there was a movement like that in Occupy Stop the Hong Stock Exchange in London. I mean, we've seen since the 2011 a multiplication of protests, which are, of course, form of resistance against this post-democratic, but for the first time, no, from the problem from the left. And I think that is basically because people feel that they cannot express anymore through the traditional political channels their rejection of disorder. In fact, I always refer to a motto of the Indignados in Spain, who was saying, we have a vote, but we don't have a voice. And I think it's absolutely the case. If you have a vote, but you are able to vote for a social center-right or center-left parties, which basically offer the same politics, you don't have a voice. And this is, I think, what I call this crisis of representation, which was very much at the origin of those protest movements. Here I want to say that there is a disagreement among people, among political theorists, when it comes to examine what are, in fact, how should we interpret those protest movements. Many theorists, those particularly which are influenced by the Exodus approach developed by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, see those recent mobilizations as a manifestation of what they call the power of the multitude. A multitude which is now constructing a new form of social relation outside traditional institutions. And they celebrate those movements as the realization of the common, and they present their encampments as the prefiguration of what they call absolute democracy. This is a term, which presented by Art and Negri as what should be, I mean, in fact, is there a way to replace the term communism, they speak absolute democracy. For people like Negri and Art and all the people that they are influencing, those protest movements should be seen as being characteristic of the new form of struggle of the precarious workers, which are typical of post-Fordism. And they argue, for instance, that the Spanish indignados, with their call for democracia realia, what we want is real democracy now, they say they advocate, in fact, not simply direct democracy, because many people have understood those movements as a cry for direct democracy. But the people defending the Exodus approach, they say, no, in fact, direct democracy is still too representative. What they want, in fact, is a democracy in which people really are going to be able to participate in a democracy that they call democracy in actu. And some of them present that as, call it a presentist democracy. You know, so basically what is at stake here is a democracy beyond representation. And for them, what they say about the current crisis is a crisis of representative democracy, but representative democracy per se. And this is, you know, what the point I want to put into question. Presentist democracy, in their view, is the opposite of representative democracy. So it is, and this is what those protest movements are fighting for. Presentist democracy is a matter of collective political practice without any claim to government. They are against any form of representation altogether. And they say that they, in fact, express a total rejection of liberal representative democracy. No, so that's an interpretation that has been presented of the rise of those protest movements. Well, my interpretation follows a different line, and this is, for instance, the question that I defend in quite a few chapters of this book, Agonistic. In my view, under Stotter's refusal of the post-political order, for me this is what they are, these protests can be read as a call for a radicalization of liberal democratic institutions, not for their rejection. What they exact are better, more inclusive form of representation. And to satisfy their demand for voice, of course, existing representative institutions have to be transformed. A new one needs to be established, as to create the condition of an agonistic confrontation where the citizen will be offered real alternative. So, of course, it's not something that requires for new form of representation, but is not a rejection of representation per se. And this is what I think that such a confrontation, seen in that term of radicalization of democracy, requires not a strategy of desertion from existing institutions, but a strategy of engagement with those institutions in order to profoundly transform them. And this is what I call a strategy of radicalization of democracy. And it requires, and I will come to that later, the emergence of a progressive project that will be able to offer an alternative to the post-political liberal consensus which is dominant in center-left parties. You know, so really, what is at stake here is there is a crisis of representation, but should the problem be seen as a total rejection of representative democracy? In fact, people in the line of Art and Negri say that representative democracy is an oxymoron, so real democracy requires total rejection of representation, or should we, and that I call that a strategy of withdrawal from institution, or should we in fact think of more of a strategy of engagement with institution in order to make representative institution more representative? And that, in my view, requires precisely that when people go to vote, they've got the possibility of a real choice. So there is an agonistic debate So this, of course, is very different political strategy. I think that one can refer to this emergence of protest movement. We can speak of and in fact, this is something that I use a term, sort of citizen awakening. And we, of course, saw that in Europe, but also in the US. And one must realize that in most places it was really short-lived. But nevertheless, it was important because it broke with the post-political consensus. And in fact, it did have some effect. For instance, I think that even if Occupy Wall Street in the US never led very far, they created a terrain that might have been propitious for the development of the Sanders movement. And at least what they definitively did was to put the question of equality back on the agenda. So, of course, they did not in fact, obviously, they did not have any demand. So, but something was stayed after that. In the case of Spain, of course, it's very different because we got the Indignados was, in fact, later followed by Podemos. But even in places where those movements did not develop into something political, like it was also the case of Nuit Debout in France, for instance. So I am very ambiguous with respect to those movements because I think that obviously something which is positive, but on their own, if they don't articulate with some form of institutional, organization, then they are not going to have really important effect. For instance, we could say in the case of the US, well, if we accept, I don't know if you accept my claim that Occupy Wall Street plays an important role, let's say a certain role in the creation of, the possibility of emergence of the Bernie Sanders movement, we all see that, well, it is exactly at the moment when there is this conversion between the horizontal and the vertical that things really become political. If you don't have this translation into a more institutional language, then you really won't have any important transformation. So this citizen awakening, as a consequence that a taboo was broken. I mean, some think in the post-political consensus about the emergence of a break. And in fact, the question of equality, and as I was saying in a moment, was put into an agenda. However, I think that one we need to insist, and that's what I was saying, that the articulation to effectively challenge neoliberal hegemony, it is crucial that those energies that have erupted in those different movements are not going to be diverted towards wrong alley. And I think that it is what happens when representative institutions are seen as the main target of the protest. There is no denying that representative institutions are in crisis in their present form. But I do not believe that the solution resides in the establishment of a non-representative democracy, or that, for instance, extra-parliamentary struggle are the only vehicle for making democratic advances, because this is also, some view that is frequently found. That there's no point in working through the institution. Only extra-parliamentary movement can make a difference. Of course, such a view is very popular among many people in the left. And this is, I think, is because it chimes with the view, which is fashionable among certain sectors of the left, that the multitude could auto-organize itself and avoid taking power and becoming state. Personally, I think that to find what I will call an anti-political approach among the activists which are involved in the various movements is something which is worrying, because it forecloses the possibility of designing an adequate strategy for their struggle. When representation is seen as the problem, then the aim cannot be to engage with current institutions to make them more representative and more accountable, but of course the objective is going to be to discard them entirely. The objective of the movement is, of course, visualized in terms of an exodus from the given form of democracy on the ground that attempting to transform existing institutions is vain and that representative democracy is to be relinquished. Many among those who reject representation, I think they do that because they identify representative democracy with its current post-democratic form and with the current working of the parliamentary system. They do not see that the problem concerns the way representative institutions function at the moment. In my view, what needs to be challenged is the lack of alternative which is offered to the citizen and not the very idea of representation. I contend that a pluralist democratic society cannot exist without representation. And for that, I have several arguments. First, I would say that an anti-essentialist approach, and of course, this is the approach that we developed with Ernesto Laclau in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, the Essex School, to which it was referred before. The idea that identities are never given. Let's say the social space is a discursive space. You don't encounter identities already there given. Identities are always the result of a discursive construction. You know, that's the fundamental thesis of the Essex School, the discursive construction of reality. So identities are never already given. They are always produced through processes of identification. And this process of identification is a process of representation. It is through representation that collective political subjects are created. They do not exist beforehand. I mean, in the case of populism, it's very important because it means that the people is just not there, something that exists to be represented. What is there is the population, but the population is a sociological notion, it's not a political one. The people, understood as a political category, is always constructed discursively. But so for that matter, so is it true for all forms of identities, and certainly for all forms of political identities, which are necessarily collective identities. So another way to put it is that every assertion of a political identity is thereby interior, not exterior, to the process of representation. And so you don't have identities that need to be representation and not representation of something which exists independently. The process of representation is process of creation of identities. So that's a first argument for which I think that to think of democracy without representation, it's not possible. But secondly, in a democratic society where pluralism is not envisaged in the harmonious anti-political form, because of course there are different forms of pluralism. There is the liberal understanding of pluralism, which is, well, there are of course a multiplicity of values and point of view, and we will not be able to adopt them all, but it's basically for empirical motive, no? Because life is too short, we only have 24 hours, but for somebody that will see society from outside, the point of view of Sirius, as it's sometimes called, that person will see all those different values constituting some kind of harmonious ensemble. So that means that I call that a pluralism without antagonism. So this is basically the liberal view of pluralism. But there is another view of pluralism, and this is the one that I personally belong to, which is the one we find in Nietzsche or in Max Weber. We speak of the polytheism of value, the war of the god, and insist on the fact that all those values can never be reconciled. If you've got pluralism, you necessarily will have antagonism. And this is, of course, what the argument I'm referring to here. If we start from a view that what is for me the political really view of pluralism, that pluralism entails the ever-present possibility of antagonism, then, of course, we realize that representative institutions, by giving form to this division of society, they play a crucial role in allowing for the institutionalization of the conflictual dimension. That's, for me, is another reason why we can't have pluralist democracy without representation. But here I want to insist that something which is quite important, this putting, allowing for the institutionalization of the conflictual dimension require that there exists an agonistic confrontation. Because if you don't have an agonistic confrontation, then of course this conflictual dimension cannot be institutionalized. And in my view, what constitutes the central problem with our current post-political model is precisely the absence of such an agonistic confrontation, which is of course how I define the post-political condition. And of course, this is not going to be remedied through purely horizontalist practices, which is of course what the other perspective pretends. But here I want to say something because I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not at all arguing here that the type of activism, which take place in those movements in the horizontal level, that's something that is no place in an agonistic democracy. In fact, I am convinced that the variety of, sometimes they are called civil society struggle, and the multiple form of activism that exist around them, that's valuable, not only to raise consciousness and to bring to the fore issues that are neglected, because this is a very, very fertile terrain, to bring to the fore those issues. So I think they are very valuable. But also because they provide realm for the cultivation of different social relations. So I think we need to acknowledge the importance of this dimension. What I contend is something different. It's not that they are not valuable. What I contend is that those practices, besides the fact that they always entail a dimension of representation, and to say that this is not it's not part of representation, that's not true. I mean, they always have got an element of representation. But more importantly, is that those practices cannot provide a substitute for representative institution, and that it is necessary to establish a synergy between those practices and other more institutional form of struggle. If the protest movement refused to establish alliances with traditional channels deemed as being intrinsically impervious to democratic transformation, then the radical potential will be lost. And this is something which I think is for me quite important. And in fact, it's part of debate that is taking place. Just to take the case of Spain, for instance, well, the people who are, of course, the indignados were very much against those forms of representation. They did not want any contact. And when Podemos arise, as Inigo and Eragon explained very well in the book that we did together, I mean, Podemos is not the parties of the indignados, and many of the people of indignados were not at all in agreement with the fact that some form of institutionalization will take place. In fact, there is still a debate today in Spain among the people who say, oh, Podemos is sold out. Only the pure horizontalist practices are important. So it is a debate which is still important in the left. The debate between horizontalism versus verticalism. For me, it's really, if we are thinking of having some impact, it is necessary to transform institutions. It's necessary to articulate this dimension with some form of channeling toward the institution, some form of well, for instance, in Podemos, they call that the development of a war machine, you know, an electoral war machine. So this is something which is important. So let's come now to left-wing populism. So far, I've argued that to address the crisis of representative democracy, what is called for the formulation of a progressive project, offering an alternative to the current post-democratic condition which, I remind you, is the product of the hegemony of neoliberalism. Well, it's not the place to enter into the content of such a project, but I'd like to say something about the kind of political movement that the success of such a project requires. And here my claim is that it should take what I call the form of a left-wing populism. Here I insist on something, and I can't develop that here, but when I use the term populism, of course I do not use it in the term in which is used by the people who want to negate it, not demagogy. Here I follow the definition which is given by Ernesto Laclau. For him, populist, he says, is the way to establish a political frontier, is the way to establish a distinction between us and them, which of course is what politics is about, and it consists in establishing the us-them in terms of the people against the establishment, the elite, the oligarchy. That's what populism is about. You know, and in fact, this is, I think that in our condition of post-democracy, if we want to re-establish, you know, the democratic core of liberal democracy, it can only be done today through the development of a left-wing populist movement that is constructing the frontier in a populist way. And here, of course, I'm saying that because there are some people who will also say, yes, we need to establish the distinction between left and right. They will agree with me that, you know, we need to fight against post-politics. But they consider that one can still reestablish it to create parties, make parties of the left really, really recover their identity. So nothing really new is they still, for instance, need to establish the frontier in the traditional way in which it is established between left and right. And here my argument is that this does not work anymore because of transformation of capitalism under, you know, the neoliberalism. There are many, in the sense that, for instance, no, it's not only as far as you are workers in a factory that you are affected or submitted to the logic of capitalism. We are all of us, in a sense, you know, really subjective to the logic. So there is the us of the collective will that is going to be organized in a left-wing way is much more transversal. It can bring together around the idea of a what we can call a collective will, a people, many more groups than the groups which were traditionally associated with the left. And also, I think that, and here I've already referred to that, what need is to establish a synergy. So it just cannot be under the form of the traditional party, even if this party is radicalized. You know, we need to try another form of organization, more of the time of what can be called a party movement, you know, in the sense of establishing a synergy between the movement, the social movement and the party form. So this is definitively one of the question which is new about the left-wing populist project. But I think what's important to realize here is that what's at stake in this left populist project is the creation of a collective will thanks to the articulation of what we call in hegemony socialist strategy a chain of equivalence among a series of democratic demands. Democratic demands that now exist. There are multiplicity of democratic demands existing in our societies, and they need to be, you know, brought together, articulated together under the creation of collective will. But I insist here again, a collective will that will be transversal, that will not be expressing the interests of people because of their place in the relation of production. Because this, of course, the difference between a populist way to construct the frontier and what would be the traditional Marxist way is not Marxist construct the frontier between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Today, a political project that want to really radicalize democracy cannot construct the frontier in that way. It must construct a frontier which is much more transversal, and this is what I call, a populist frontier. So articulation between the horizontal, and the vertical. So this is, to resume a little bit my argument here, is that, of course, if we want to escape post-democracy, one of the main things to do is to break with the post-political consensus, re-establish again an agonistic debate. And that requires creating a new political frontier, because here I insist on, again, for me, politics is got necessarily to do with the creation of a frontier, us and them. So we need to re-establish the frontier, but we need to re-establish it in a different way, in a populist way. And here, of course, you will understand that, and I use the term populism in a positive way, contrary to most of the people who present populism as a perversion of democracy or a pathology of democracy. In fact, I think that for me, populism is a necessary component of democracy. Because democracy, after all, comes from the Greek demos kratos, the power, the sovereignty of the people. So without the construction of a people, you can't have democracy. So there is and if you accept to call the construction of the people, the dimension of construction of people, the populist dimension, then of course it is central to democracy. So I think that instead of rejecting the term populist, because many people no, we are not populist, because they understand populism only in terms of demagogy. My argument that we need to reclaim the term populism. We need to say, yes, of course we are populist, because we are democracy. We want to create, to radicalize democracy and want to create a people. So I think that, of course, it's very important to leave aside this negative understanding of populism. But it's evident also that there are different forms of populism. And for instance, you say, okay, populism is about establishing a frontier between us and them. But who is going to construct, to be part of the us, and who is going to be part of the them? Of course, you can have different forms of populism. The us can be constructed in a way, and that, for instance, is the case of Marine Le Pen in France, ethno-nationalist, where the us is only the nationals and the them are the immigrants. I mean, that's a right-wing populist way. But you can also construct the us in a very much wider way, which include the immigrant, and which, for instance, the them is the forces of neoliberalism. This is, for instance, the way in which Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France constructs the us and the them. So there is really a big difference. While we can all accept that it's make much more sense to construct the political frontier today, given the condition of the development of capitalism. We need also to be aware of the fact that this populist frontier can be constructed in many different ways. So what I'm arguing here is, in fact, for the construction of the political frontier in a populist left-wing way. This, I think, is for me absolutely central. And to articulate, to federate a series of democratic demands in order to create a collective will. I think that maybe some of you will disagree with me, but I view Bernie Sanders, for instance, as a left-wing populism. I think that's definitively what I have in mind when I speak of left-wing populism. For instance, obviously the case of Podemos in Spain, but also the case of Mélenchon in France. Let me see what time it is. Okay.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, yes, okay. Yeah. I want to make a last point, and here, since I am in European Studies Center, I think it's particularly relevant to speak about that. When I speak of the importance to develop a left-wing populist movement, and here I will say, for me, this is definitively the only way to fight against the growth and the increasing success of right-wing populism. But obviously, I also want to insist that this left-wing populism should have a European, well, as I was saying, I'm speaking from the point of view of Europe, should have a European dimension, because it's obvious that if the aim is to offer an alternative to neoliberalism, this is not going to be possible only at the national level. You know, this, and as we've seen with the tragic case of Greece, because Greece, of course, Tsipras and Syriza is a left-wing populist movement, but when they came to power, then of course the forces of the European Union impeded the Tsipras to put into practice this anti-austerity problem. In a sense, we understand why they did that, because they could not allow, they've always been saying there is no alternative to austerity. They could not possibly allow an experience, you know, left-wing popular experience, which will show, no, there is an alternative. So this is why the success of a left-wing populist movement, the need to have a European dimension. It is something which is really crucial, because even if it comes only in a more important country than Greece, like in France, for instance, or in Spain, you know, they are not going to be able on their own, you know, to really offer an alternative to neoliberalism. But I have also some other reason to insist on the need of creating a left-wing populist movement. And of course, this left-wing populist movement, I think, should be able to bring about an agonistic confrontation about the future of Europe. And I am convinced that in the present conjuncture in Europe, such a confrontation is absolutely vital. Many people on the left are beginning to doubt the possibility of constructing within the framework of the EU an alternative to the neoliberal model of globalization. The EU is increasingly perceived as being an intrinsically neoliberal project, a project that cannot be reformed. They say that it's vain to try transforming its institution, and the only solution that remains is to exit. Such a pessimistic view is no doubt the result of the fact that all attempts to challenge the prevalent neoliberal rules are constantly presented as expression of anti-European attacks against the very existence of the Union. So if you do not agree with the really existing European Union, which of course is a neoliberal project, then automatically you are anti-European. So this, of course, leads people to say, okay, you know, if any critique means that we are anti-European, we might as well become really anti-European. And this is why I think without the possibility of making legitimate criticism of the current neoliberal policies, it's not surprising that a growing number of people are turning to Euroscepticism. They believe that it's the European project itself that is the cause of our current predicament, and they fear that more European integration can only mean a reinforcement of neoliberal hegemony. It's clear that such a position endangers the survival of the European project, and that the only way to stop the expansion of this Euroscepticism is by creating the condition for a democratic contestation within the European Union. And of course, the objective should be a democratic refundation of Europe. And of course, there is probably a debate exactly about that. Is it possible or is it not possible? I personally want to, hope and wish that for the possibility of this democratic refundation. In my view, what lies at the bottom of the disaffection with the EU is the absence of a project that could foster a strong identification among the citizens of Europe and provide an objective to mobilize their political passion in a democratic direction. The EU is currently composed of consumers, not of citizens. It has been mainly constructed around a common market and has never really created a genuine common will. No wonder that in time of economic crisis and austerity policy, some people begin to question its utility, forgetting what has been its important achievement in bringing peace to the continent. So what is necessarily needed in order to foster popular allegiance to the EU is the elaboration of a socio-political project offering an alternative to neoliberal model. And of course, this model is today in crisis, but no alternative has yet become available. So we could say, following Gramsci, that the old model cannot continue, but the new one is not yet born. Alas, the center-left cannot take advantage of this situation because it has accepted for too long the idea that there was no alternative to neoliberal globalization. Moreover, in many countries, center-left government have played an important role in the process of deregulation and privatization that have contributed to the consolidation of neoliberal hegemony. To be sure, European institutions have got a very big part of responsibility in the current crisis. It is a mistake, however, to present this crisis as a crisis of the European project. For me, it should be seen as a crisis of the neoliberal incarnation of the European project. And this is why, of course, all attempts to solve the crisis by more neoliberal policies is not going to succeed. In my view, the only way to fight against the rise of anti-European feeling and to stop the growth of right-wing populist parties that excite those feelings is by uniting European citizens around a new vision that will be presented precisely by a left-wing populism project for Europe, and a project that could give them hope of a democratic future. Establishing at the European level a synergy between left parties and social movement around such a vision could make possible the emergence of a collective will aiming at a radical transformation of the current hegemonic order. And I am convinced that without the development of left populist movement able to mobilize people, hope and passion towards a more just and egalitarian society, there is a serious risk that right-wing populist parties will succeed in occupying this terrain. And in that case, I'm afraid that what expects us is much worse than the current post-democracy. Thank you.
I would like to ask you a question about the need to construct an us and the them, which you think is fundamental for a successful left populist movement. And it is one of the things that in actual practice, for instance, in Spain, the case I'm most familiar with, is often used by those who, the opponents of left populists, to criticize them, to say that that this is a form of demagogy. And so you said today that what is important is that the us be a multiple or have include multiple different people with multiple demands, but that at the same time that it be anti an establishment. And so what I'm wondering is if
you need to have a them, you need to have an adversary.
Right. So the question is, do you have to construct the them in terms of a group of people or a set of ideas?
Well, not a set. It can't just be the set of ideas. It needs to be an institution. Or, for instance, let's say if you are thinking of the them being the forces of neoliberalism, that is the case but to give you an example, again to the case of France, the way the us and the them is constructed, as I was saying, by Marine Le Pen, and by Jean-Luc Mélenchon is very different. But while Marine Le Pen goes to the popular classes and tell them, I understand your problems, but the problems, those are the responsible for them are the immigrants. So the them is the immigrant. Jean-Luc Mélenchon goes to also, it takes account of the demand of the popular sector, because the main problem in France, and that's not only in France, that the popular categories, which are the loser of globalization, is being completely forgotten, left aside by the social democratic parties, which are supposed to take their interest, So the success of right-wing populists comes from having addressed their problems. So left-wing populism must address those problems too, but of course give them another solution. And for instance, in the case of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, well, he said, yeah, I understand your problem, but the responsible are not the immigrants. The responsible for that are the forces of neoliberalism. But so of course it can not be. It's neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is just too vague, and it should not be necessarily people, but it could be, institution. For instance, some transnational corporation, the IMF, so it will be, it just can't be too abstract. This is, for instance, why I find very, and I've got a lot of discussion about that here, but you can't just say that the enemy is capitalism, capitalism, what people, it is so abstract, the enemy is capitalism. No, I mean, this is not the way to construct an adversary. But an adversary, of course, you should not, at least for a left-wing populism, say is this individual, because the question is always a structural reason, so this will be, well, I don't know, to say the World Bank, the IMF, a series of institutions, a series of organizations. So it needs to be, in fact, in between what you are saying. It can't just be one individual. It cannot be something too abstract. It needs to be something that the people can more or less begin to see what the forces of neoliberalism, and of course, it depends on the cases, because forces of neoliberalism are, of course, very, very multiple, and it depends exactly. For some people, is the one that affect them more are some forces. For other people, it's going, but clearly, it should be in terms of structural forces, not individuals, and not abstract ideas like capitalism.
Okay. Is it the center left, those responsible for having sold the left out to this
yeah, but no, I would say, for instance, the real adversary of for left-wing populists, you can't just be the Socialist Party, of course, because the Socialist Party, the problem is that it has become complicit with the forces of neoliberalism. But they are just the people who transmit that. They are not. It's not by getting rid of the Socialist Party that you are going to solve the problem. You need to see what are exactly the structural transformation which are needed. It's not simply a replacement of popular political people. It needs to be No, I think, that, for instance, to take again the case of France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon is very critical of the Socialist Party. Jean-Luc Mélenchon considered that the Socialist Party is not a vehicle anymore for democratization of France, but he's not saying that the Socialist Party is responsible for the situation, you know? So this is why I think it will be very dangerous to see because they are not the cause, they are just the people who allow for this to take place and might have contributed to that, but they are not the one who are really at the origin of the problem. It is the neoliberal institution and all the neoliberal forces which are explain the fact that now we are living in post-democratic societies.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, I had a question. So one of your main arguments is in liberal democracies, the liberal tradition and the democratic tradition are sort of contingently articulated, but do not necessarily go in hand, right? Can you hear me well? Yeah, I think it's on. Oh, there you go. So this idea that, yeah, liberalism and democracy operate with different logics and do not necessarily go hand in hand. Obviously, I agree with you on that. I think you're spot on. But I think for parties of the left, sometimes we tend to talk about equality, but it can be useful to talk about liberty, and I would like to know your opinion of this, to resignify the concept of liberty so that liberty is not understood as, have the liberty or the freedom to hire and fire however I want, but I have the freedom that socialist healthcare gives me so that I don't have to think, save money or think that I'm going to have to dispose of my savings if I suddenly fall ill. The idea that socialist medicine is a right, but it's also a freedom, and that it gives you like the choice to do more with your life and have more opportunities and for more, emancipated existence. I think that is a useful way that the left can translate its ideas to people, especially in places like the US, where the idea of socialism is still understood in very abstract terms, sort of associated with big state projects, but it's not sometimes thought of something that can make people's everyday life easier. I'd like to know your opinion.
No, I agree completely with you about that. And of course, look, I also insist, for me, really, what I call pluralist democracy, because I think that what is, for me, valuable in the articulation between liberalism and democracy is the fact that liberalism is broad pluralism to democracy. Pluralism is not something which is intrinsic to democracy. You know, in fact, the one with written interesting things about that, and the danger of a pure democratic ideal without any link could perfectly lead to a totalitarian system. Because and this is what I think, for instance, John Stuart Mill for me was very important, because he's in his book on liberty, and he say, well, yeah, democracy, but they are the minorities, and we also need to take a purely majoritarian democracy. Well, there are of course a lot of people like Talmont who have written the democracy and totalitarianism, and I think Le Faux showed that in fact, yeah, there is a certain danger, if you only think in terms of give the way to the people to decide. Of course, there are some people who believe that, but this is to start from a very optimistic view, that the people necessarily will be pluralistic. The people, I think that, and that's the good thing about Schmitt, for instance, when he said that a serious political theory need always start from a different kind of political anthropology, to the idea that man is, what they call it, a dangerous being. It can be, open to the good and the bad. So you can't start from the idea that if the people are going to decide really democratically, they would necessarily, no. We need to have, in French we say garde-fou for that. I don't really know, you could say that in English, counter effects, or what was garde-fou? Counterweight, yes, okay. So this is why I think that, the articulation between liberalism and democracy this is why our democracy today is pluralist. And in fact, Well, that's something I also want to say, because it's also a lot of discussion about that at the moment. If you accept that this articulation is an historical contingent articulation, because that's a point which I'm not introduced in my talk, but I think it's also something which is important. There's no necessity, contrary to Habermas, who believe that there is a co-originality between liberty and equality. I don't agree with that. I think there has been a political articulation which I value and I want to defend. But of course, it means that you can have democracy without liberalism. In the same way as we have liberalism without democracy, in fact, in Latin America, there were many regimes which are liberal, but not at all democratic. And you can also have democracy without liberalism. And in fact, there is a lot of discussion today about illiberal democracy. Well, for instance, I think that, and the example that they are given is Putin and Orban and things. Well, you know, people can't say those are not democratic. Well, we can say they are not democratic according to our understanding of democracy. Yes, of course, they don't correspond to the Western model of democracy. But to say that those people are not democratic, on which basis? If you think that democracy is, you know, the sovereignty of the people, it does not necessarily include liberal institution. So this is why I think it's very important to maintain the tension. I'm not saying that we need to create a situation in which it's the pure democratic logic which is going to be the dominant one. No, I think that would be a real problem. And of course, this is also why I find very worrying the opposition to political liberalism that exists in many sectors of the left. You know, they see the liberalism as something which is necessarily go against democracy. I don't think that at all. I think that a certain understanding of liberalism, a certain understanding of liberty is very important to maintain, to recover, and in our case, in fact, because this is precisely what neoliberalism has done, is to translate, re-signify liberty in a very limited sense. Yeah, I agree with you. We need to re-signify it in a much more progressive way. But I wouldn't say, no, I'm not saying, thinking that this is what you are saying, but I want to insist, for me, the struggle is not simply about re-signifying the idea of liberty in a more progressive way. It's also linked with the idea of re-establishing the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea of equality. So rebalancing them, not replacing liberty by equality, but rebalancing the two. And I think for me, it's, and because this is precisely what when I speak of an agonistic struggle, is a struggle between those two principles and to see which is the one which is becoming hegemonic at the moment. And this is, of course, also what gives people the possibility of choice. You know, this for me, this tension and between liberty and equality is precisely at the core of pluralist democracy and at the core of what I call an agonistic confrontation.
Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you. That was a really provocative talk, and thank you very much for coming.